Hi everyone, this is the first in a series of videos on how to construct a medieval crossbow. It's intended for the folks who have purchased the medieval crossbow kit, but it'll be good for anybody who's interested in how to construct a medieval crossbow. The design that we're aiming for today is a typical 15th century Central European design that was really common throughout what's now Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, and also in parts of Scandinavia. Some of the characteristic features of this type are a tiller or stock with a round cross section that was typically between 800 and 1000 millimeters in length, a single axle rolling nut lock, a fairly long trigger lever, and a heavy composite prod which was typically made from horn and sinew, and they had draw weights that were sometimes in excess of 1,000 pounds. We've got a good starting point here with the medieval crossbow kit, the roughed out tiller, and it includes everything you need to make the crossbow. The main differences between the historical originals and what we are building here today are, first of all, for ease of use, we're using a bolt track instead of the bolt rest at the forefront of the crossbow, which was more typical of the historical examples. And secondly, and the most significant difference, is the prod that we're using. As I mentioned before, the prod in the historical examples, horn and sinew, these are very complex, very expensive to make, and took actually up to 2 years for all the glue to cure properly in them. And again, the draw weights were up to 1,000 pounds, which simply for recreational use today is just not practical. So instead, we're using a 70-pound draw weight fiberglass and wood laminate prod. You're not going to win any battles with this, but it's perfect for a bit of fun target shooting. Today we're going to start with the roughed out stock or tiller and figure out how we're going to shape it into the design that we're looking for. Taking a closer look at the historical example, and this one is currently housed in the Met, there are some key characteristics here that we want to replicate on ours. Namely, these stopped chamfers that are on the top between the nut and the base of the prod binding, or bridle, the rounded midsection, and the gracefully tempered butt. Let's start with laying out the lines for the chamfers. Basically, when you cut off or round off the corners of a rectangle, it's called a chamfer. So these chamfers at the front of the crossbow on the top. The reason for these chamfers between the nut and the string is to reduce the friction on the string when shooting, as it does press down a little bit on the top of the tiller. Stopped chamfers are used when you want a fairly abrupt transition between the squared area and the rounded area. You'll see this used fairly frequently in furniture making. To do this, we are first going to mark where the chamfer stops around the bridle hole, which is also roughly the point where the string sits when at rest. Next, we're going to mark the back end of these chamfers, which for now will stop at the center point of the lock, right on the edge of the tiller. Later on, we'll be incorporating these chamfers into the rounding of the rest of the tiller. So we're just going to mark it there and here. At the front mark, we're going to measure in from the edges to approximately 7 millimeters or 1/4 inch on either side of the center line. This will give us the width of the narrowest portion of the top. Next, we're going to draw a line from the front marking to the rear marking. Finally, draw a line at approximately 45 degrees from the point where the front line meets the edge of the tiller, here, to the chamfer line. You want it to end up roughly about 1/2 inch from that front line. So, like so. You can do that on both sides. We've now laid out the top of the chamfer. We still need to lay out the side of the chamfer, which we'll do in just the same way. First, we'll mark out where the chamfer stops at the front. So again, at the bridle hole, and at the lock, here. We now need to decide how deep the chamfer will go down the side. It doesn't need to be as deep as the top, so we're aiming here for a gentle sort of rounding. So measure approximately 10 millimeters from the top of the tiller and mark it. And this you're measuring at that front line. So now you want to connect those two marks right at the edge of the lock, then down to the mark you just made at the bridle hole. It's handy to have a flexible ruler like this one so it can follow the contour of the roughed out tiller. And finally, you want to add another one of these 45-degree lines here, which will be where the chamfer stops. You can match the point that you did before, again about 1/2 inch between there and there. Okay, so your line simply goes like that. So you're going to want to repeat that process on the other side as well. And then you're ready to start cutting. Remember, these lines don't need to be absolutely perfect. They're basically providing a guide for us as we carve out the chamfer. I have found that the easiest way to cut these chamfers and avoid splitting the wood is to make a small relief cut here, right across that edge. Carefully saw towards the chamfer lines, stopping just short of both the top and the side. Next, take a chisel or a knife and start your cut at the front along the 45-degree line, taking small bites and cutting from the end of the chamfer here towards the relief cut. There. Keep shaving away until you reach the bottom of that saw cut. Make sure you don't cut past those lines for now. Now you can do the same from the other side. Of course, this time you're taking shallower angled cuts as you go, gradually starting further and further back towards the nut until you've pared down the wood to the lines and to the saw cut. And then repeat this whole process on the other side. As I'm going, I'm paying very close attention to where that bottom line is and where that top line is, so that I don't take off too much material. And as you're cutting along here, you'll notice that the angle of your chisel is going to change. As it moves up, it's gradually going to rotate slightly this way towards the top as you come to the end of this chamfer line. Just cleaning up just a little bit, paring a little away. There. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. All this is going to get cleaned up with sandpaper once we're done with the other side. Now that you've carved out the chamfers, you can use sandpaper to clean up the saw and the blade marks. I find 80, 100 grit, this is really good at this stage. You can also use a file or a rasp for this, but I prefer sandpaper as it is much less likely to splinter the wood at the edges of the chamfer. So I've got some 80 grit sandpaper here, and I'm just wrapping it around a piece of dowel, and that gives you a nice rounded edge you can then use to run up and down the chamfer, and particularly the stopped part. You can see already that saw mark is gone. There. Just do the same on the other side. Now we're going to repeat the process on the bottom of the tiller between the nut and the bridle hole. However, this time we are not going to use a stopped chamfer, as the transition between the rounded area and the squared front is a little more gradual on the bottom, as you can see here on the original. Here we're looking at the underside of the front of the tiller. Like the top, we're going to mark the beginning of the chamfer here at the bridle and the end of the chamfer here at the nut. You can see where the nut's going to sit because there's the axle hole for it. Mark it on the side and on the top. And go straight across. Straight across. These chamfers won't be as deep as the top ones, as we are simply aiming for a gentle curve for the bottom. So at the approximate midpoint between the front and rear lines, you can measure it, you can eyeball it, either way. You want to measure in and mark 7 millimeters, or about 1/4 inch, from the bottom of the tiller. So first we're going to mark our midpoint, so it's roughly here. We'll just extend that across. So 1/4 inch, 7 mil, from the bottom of the tiller, right there. And we're going to connect the front and rear points with the ends of that line. We're also going to do 7 millimeters in from the side. And now we're ready to connect the points. So from here, right at the edge of the tiller, to the point we just made, oops, a straight line, and again, right to that edge of the tiller where that line meets the edge. And then again on the side. As before, these don't have to be super precise and exact, because this is a guide for our carving. This is not really something that needs to be a precise measurement. Of course, with my clamp here, I don't have enough clearance for the ruler. So taking a closer look at what we've just done, you can see this almost diamond shape. And that is what we're carving out. And that's just taking that corner off. So this time we're going to make another relief cut, but because we're not using a stopped chamfer, we're going to make our relief cut right in the center here. And then once we've done that, we're going to cut towards that relief cut, starting close to it and gradually moving our way back until we've taken off all the material between the side line and this line, the bottom line. Sometimes if you don't go quite deep enough with the saw, you can give it a little tap with the chisel there to cut off those chips. See how I'm going? I started right at the relief cut, cutting towards it, and I'm gradually moving the chisel back and back and back. That ensures that you're keeping a very good control of the cut, you're not trying to take off too much wood, and it really minimizes the chance of splintering. There. You can even just gently pare down just a little bit to finish that up and get towards the lines there. You'll just split a little bit. That's why you got to be careful. There. And once you've done the other side, then just like before, we're going to take our sandpaper and give it a sand. Now that we've got the front end sorted out, let's round out the rest of the stock, starting with the butt end. The goal here is to end up with a gracefully tapering shape with a rounded cross section that feels comfortable in the hand. At the end, we're aiming for a sort of egg-shaped profile that's typical on this crossbow type. I find it easiest to sketch that egg right onto the end of the tiller, and then I use that to figure out where the endpoints of the chamfer are going to be. In this case, you can see what I've done is scribed lines here to show where the sketch meets the edges, and that is going to be the line that we use, the mark that we use to draw our chamfer line to the points at the lock, which I'll show you in a moment. As with the front chamfers, we're now going to make these layout lines, these marks that we put down at the butt, we're going to make them meet the points at the lock that we made before, here and here. So you'll need a long, flexible, straight edge for this. And remember, these lines are going right to the edge of the tiller, oops, at the lock. There's one. There's two. So you're going to want to do that on the top, the bottom, and on the other side. The tool that I find best for doing these chamfers, if I can find it, is a simple block plane. If you don't have one of these, again, even a pocket knife will work. Chisel will work, although you will get undulations, as you might have noticed when you did those front chamfers. But again, those are things that can all be sort of ironed out with just sanding. Takes a while, but it'll work. But if you have a little block plane, this is going to really serve you very well for this operation. So working from the high point, which is at the lock, to the low point, which is at the end, just take nice long cuts, paying close attention to where that cut is in relation to the lines that you drew, because you don't want to go over. Sometimes what I like to do is go pretty close to the line on one side, and then go close to the line on the other side, back and forth until I've got a nice flat plane. And also remember, the angle of the plane on the edge is going to shift, because closer to the lock here, it gets very close to being flat, and as you come down, it's going to rotate just a little bit. So keep that in mind while you're planing. There. That's the two bottom ones done. Looks fairly even. The beauty of doing this kind of work is that you can always go back again. We can go back to the front chamfers if we want, clean them up a little more, refine the shape. There's no correct way really to do this. This is all a guideline, and it's really important to remember you can use your own creativity in this too. So if you want to go deeper and more exaggerated on these chamfers, go for it. Again, a simple clamp. You could clamp this to your kitchen table and do it. I'm looking at both sides of the wood so I can see both the top line and the side line to make sure I don't go over on either side. Take your time. There's no rush on this stuff. The more patient and more time you take, the better your result will be. This is a lesson that I would like to say I've learned over many years, but I'm still learning it. So you can see the egg shape has formed. Now we're ready to incorporate all those chamfers into a nice continuing rounding off all the way along the tiller on all four corners. So like before, we simply need to mark out on the top and the sides how deep we want this chamfer to go, i.e. how much material we want to take off. For the top, I like to keep at least a 1/4 inch, 5 to 7 millimeters of material on either side of this mortise where the nut goes. That's just for the strength. The prod that we're going to be using on this is only about 70 pounds, but nevertheless, I'd like to keep that amount of wood there just to make sure that it maintains the structural integrity of the tiller. So let's measure out 5 mil on either side of the mortise. So I'm marking that. Let's intersect that with that, again, that original line we made right at the beginning. And there we have 2 marks that we want. Now for the side of the chamfer, you're going to want to measure down roughly a 1/2 inch, 13 mil. And again, make your mark. So there's our 13 mil. That's here. Again, intersecting with my poorly drawn line there. That's another mark. You're going to want to do the same on the other side. From these 2 marks that you've made, here and here, just simply scribe a straight line forward until it meets up with the chamfer that we've already cut in. Then you want to do it back towards the butt as well. That's going to be a longer line until it hits that chamfer. There. It's a little hard to see on camera, I think, but the 2 lines are there. Again, same on the side. Now in this case, instead of going straight forward on the side, we're going to angle it up just a little bit, the ruler, until we hit the bottom of the chamfer stop there. And what we've just defined then with these lines is all this material is going to come off. For this rear one, you can go more or less straight back until you hit the line that you made, or rather the previous chamfer. There it is. So we've now marked out the rest of the material on this top side that we're going to want to take off. So as before, we're going to make a relief cut. This time it's right where the axle hole is, but that's okay. But be very careful that you don't cut over into the mouth of the mortise. Now you're ready once again for chiseling. Taking small bites and working towards the relief cut. Now, same again on the back. Again, being very careful with the grain. Now, one tool that I love using for this kind of work is a spoke shave. You can see here where the work we just did is now blending in to that rear chamfer. That's what you want to see. So just keep working away until everything's blended nicely. Obviously do the same on the other side. And we're doing the same again on the bottom. We're measuring down. On the bottom chamfers, I like to do roughly 10 millimeters down from the bottom. Again, where it intersects that line that we drew from the lock. And about the same from the edge on the very bottom. So, 10 millimeters in from the bottom and 10 millimeters up, from the side, 10 millimeters up from the bottom. And as we did before, we're going to connect those lines. Now on the bottom, unlike on the top, we don't have that stopped chamfer. So we can go just straight. I'm gonna put in a relief cut and then take all that material off. As you're working, always keep an eye on those lines. You can see I'm starting to chip out here, which means we need to start reversing the direction of our chisel. So we just blended it right into where we had cut in before. We want to do the same again on this side. Now that we've created all those chamfers, you'll likely have a sort of faceted appearance. We'll want to round off all of those facets to get a nice rounded appearance. You can do this with the spoke shave or a knife. However, it's easy to accidentally take off too much material, so some rough grit sandpaper works really well here too, maybe 80 grit or so. You just want to keep on sanding off these ridges to get rid of the facets so that we end up with something nice and rounded. I'm using about 80 grit sandpaper here, which is pretty aggressive. It can take you a while, so you can also use the spoke shave, which is really handy. You just got to be very gentle because it can be pretty aggressive. The blade is set kind of high on this, so I'm trying to be really careful, but this is a pretty nice, quick and easy way to get rid of those ridges, those facets. In fact, that's actually what this tool is absolutely designed to do, is for rounding off long stock like this. Looking pretty good. The final carving task is a quick one. You'll need to smooth out the front of the bridle holes so that the edge doesn't cut into the bridle when you're ready to bind on the prod. You can do this with a chisel, knife, file, and/or sandpaper. And that's it. Your tiller is now shaped into an authentic 15th century Central European medieval design, and it's ready for decorating. For the decoration, you can use everything from traditional bone or antler inlays, wood inlays, or you can simply paint on a traditional inlay pattern or come up with your own. I'm going to paint on those nice hot rod flames like the example in the Met that we looked at before. Once I'm done with that, we'll talk about finishes. So I've got the tiller painted now. I'm pretty happy with the result. I used gesso because that's what I had on hand, which is a kind of primer that artists use to treat their canvas before they start painting. I think it's worked fairly well for this. I've never actually painted a crossbow tiller before. I've typically done inlays for decoration. But overall, not bad. So for the finish, there are several options available to you. One of the easiest and most effective is linseed oil. Even just one coat of this stuff will bring out the grain of the wood and make it look amazing. It gives it a silk, smooth kind of feel. Another option is varathane if you want a more glossy look. For this, just apply in several thin coats, and between each coat let it dry and give it a light sand with some high grit sandpaper, like 320 grit or so. The more coats that you use on this, the more lustrous and glossy it's going to get. And there we have the tiller. Rubbed down with linseed oil. You can see it's really made the wood contrast nicely with the paint, which of course that will do too if you decide to be adventurous and do some inlays. So that's it for today. Your tiller is ready for assembly. The next video will give an in-depth tutorial about how to bind together the tiller, the prod, and the stirrup. So see you next time.